Hello and welcome to another episode of Exploring Standards. I'm your host, Jess, and today I am joined by CEO and Director of Assent Risk Management, Rob. Rob, how are you today?
Hi, Jess. Yeah, good, thank you. How are you?
Really good, thank you. So Rob's been on the show a couple of times already, and this season he's kicking off with an episode about beginning your ISO journey. So kind of looking at, you've not been in the ISO before, you're thinking, I'm going to get a standard, I'd like to get a certification, but I don't really know where to start, I don't know anything. And that's kind of the aim for this episode, is to kind of go through how to start your ISO journey. So I'm going to kick off with the first question straight away. How do you choose the right standard? How do you know which standard to choose? That's a big one for people, isn't it?
Yeah, it is, Jess. So I wrote a blog very similar to this recently, which is a very honest blog over my years in the ISO business. And the focus of that blog was about it being a distress purchase. Mm-hmm. I think the real thing to draw from that is that people don't necessarily do ISO implementations or ISO certification because they really want to. Very rarely we find that, but mostly it does come across as a bit of a distressed purchase because there's pressure on people to achieve these certifications, and that normally comes from their clients or their potential clients. So what we often see is there's perhaps a big tender has been released, perhaps it's a public sector thing, or a very big company has put a call out for services, and part of that tender probably says in there which ISO standards you should be certified to. And often the reality is, if you're not certified to those standards, you're going to fall at the first hurdle because there's obviously lots of people quoting for that work, and buyers have got to find a way of reducing that down to a short list of providers. So in terms of which standard you should go for, mostly we find it's a commercial driver. You know, what are you being asked for by your customers? What's going to give you the best value in terms of return on investment? Of course, there's lots of other benefits to having ISO standards, depending which ones they are, but they all focus on different things. It might be improving your impact on the environment, or increasing your security around information and data protection. And you've got to achieve those benefits as well. Mm-hmm. But mostly when you're choosing which one to go for, mostly it's going to be about what customers are asking for and where the value is going to be for you.
Okay, that's interesting to hear that. Obviously, it is more distress purchase rather than people wanting to come in and improve their company. Obviously, as you said, you do get to see the benefits of it. So I guess really it's just down to what your organisation is needing at the time. So you've decided you're going to implement an ISO. What are the first steps you need to take when starting your ISO journey?
Well, of course, the best thing to do is pick up the phone to us at Assent, and our consultants will guide you through the whole process.
And this is where the podcast ends.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. But just to break that down a little bit, I think what we do as ISO consultants is not particularly difficult, really. And there's lots of information out there on the web. So people can do it themselves if they wanted to, and if they had the time to research it and learn from many of the mistakes that we've made over the years, they'll get there in the end. But in terms of bringing a consultant like Assent Risk Management on board, is we can shortcut all that because we know how to do this. We do it many times. We know the pitfalls to avoid. We know how to make the audit process with the certification body nice and smooth. So certainly give us a call. I mean, even if it's just an initial conversation about how it might work and how we might scope it, that can give you a good lead into the standard if you didn't want to proceed with us. We can certainly talk about the best approach. In terms of the steps to take, obviously the best thing to do is get a copy of the standard if you're not going to use a consultant. It's good to have a copy of the standard anyway, you should do. But if you use a consultant like us, we would have interpreted that for your business and your industry. But really, if you're going to do these standards, you need to know what's in there. So that's the first thing I would say. And then the second thing is to break that standard out. So clause by clause, looking at what it's asking for. I'll try and match that to what you're doing already. So that's what we would call a gap analysis exercise, which is something we would perform for customers as a first step. Because it's a really quick and easy process for us. as consultants to run through. Obviously, you could do that yourself as well. And it means that we can see what's going on. We can look at what you're doing already. So we don't want to make major changes to your company because you're probably doing lots of good stuff. But that gap analysis process just helps us to identify obviously where the gaps are, and then we can fill that in. So I certainly think that's a good first step. After that gap analysis is done, you can then make more decisions about the project. You might decide not to continue because you might feel like there's just too many gaps at the moment. You might delay it. Or you might decide to bring in a consultant at that point to help fill the gaps. Or, of course, you might start to go about filling those gaps in. And that's also, at that point, it's a good way to estimate the time frame of this. That's another thing that we're often asked as consultants is how long will it take? What's the resource commitment on both sides? And from the client side, that's very difficult to sort of estimate until you've done that gap analysis. So that would be my first step.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you so much. Okay, so you've taken your first few steps into your ISO journey. You've decided to get a gap analysis, but you're wondering now what's the difference between implementation and certification? Can you kind of give us a bit more information on those two?
Yeah, of course. So these are both terms that you hear a lot around ISO standards. So when we say we're implementing something, obviously means we're putting in place the requirements of the standard. And most of these standards that we work with are called management systems. So it's a system of managing the business, and they have particular disciplines. As we said earlier, environmental or safety or information security, for example. So the implementation part is really putting those things in place. Part of that is documentation, although ISO does have a bad reputation for being document heavy. That's definitely improved over recent years. There's many fewer documents that are mandatory. The way we approach it now is very much if we need a document because there's a benefit, then we'll put one in place. So that helps with communicating certain things, certain policies or certain processes and how things are done. So there can be lots of benefits, but we don't just write stuff for no reason and have it sat there doing nothing. So we do streamline it nowadays. But then in addition to that, there might be some technical controls that you put in place, particularly with standards like ISO 27001, because that's a very technology leaning standard. It's not all about technology, it's about protecting information. But obviously these days, a lot of that is technology based. So there'll be some technical things you can put into place. And of course, training staff on all of those new things, all of those improved processes is important as well. So the implementation process is really putting this management system in place for your company and getting it ready. And actually, it can stop there if you wanted. You don't have to go and get a certificate for it. In fact, the way the standards are written is they define what the management system should be. They don't actually talk about certification at all. That's an additional piece on top. As we said at the beginning of this podcast, it's unlikely that you would do this just because you wake up and think it's a good idea. Mostly you are looking for that certification. So if we look at the benefits of that side of things, the certification is really an impartial third party coming in to assess your system against the requirements of that standard. So that's a good attestation that you're doing what you say you do. And for that reason, we always promote accredited certification. So in the UK, that would be through UCAS, and UCAS accredit a number of certification bodies. And those certification bodies must, in their activities around certification, they must be impartial, which generally means that they don't do consulting like we do. They're just there to assess and check. And that means when they issue a certificate to say you're compliant, that carries a lot of value because there's no conflict of interest. There's no incentive for them to issue the certificate other than that they found you to be compliant. And of course, the certificate is a thing you can give to clients and to potential clients as kind of evidence that that you're doing what you say.
Okay, thank you so much for that. It's good to know that. Oh, it's interesting to know, that you don't have to necessarily go for certification, that the implementation is absolutely fine. I mean, as you said, if you're going to go for this, most people do go for the certification, but it's good to know that actually you can get to the implementation point and stop there, if you needed to for whatever reason. So we talked a lot about the implementation process already, but I would like to know, is this the process the same for all ISO standards?
Yeah, I think that's a good question, actually. I think it's broadly the same. So you could do a gap analysis against any standard because you're just breaking out what's in there and looking at where the gaps are. And then that would lead on to an implementation process where you're putting stuff in place. Obviously, the things you put in place are going to be different. And the way that we work in Assent is we've broken out those standards into tasks. And some of those tasks might have a policy or a document attached to them, but other ones might just be to implement a process in the company. We talked about training staff earlier, so it might be some training that's needed, or some communication around something, or some monitoring of a certain thing. So those are the bits that are different, but essentially the process is exactly the same. We would just work through the tasks in that project and work with the client on that. And once they're all done, we'll do some internal audits. That's a bit we haven't covered yet, but sort of towards the end of the project, we would do internal audits just to check that everything was functioning well. Anything new has been adopted and is in place. And then if you did decide to go for certification after that, then you'd be in a really good place to move forward.
Okay, that's interesting to hear. I think with the implementation process being the same, I can see how maybe, when we get our clients come in, they adhere to one certification, they have to come back and get a second. And that's probably wise because they understand the process now of the implementation. So you've got your implementation, you've got your standard implemented. How do you prepare for ISO certification?
Okay, great. Well, as we said, that's an optional step, but it's a step most people take. So I guess the first thing is to engage with the certification body. We say to do that early on because their dates can take some time to organise, depends how busy they are and what else is going on in the market. But choosing a certification body is an important step. We can help you with that. At Assent, we are impartial on certification bodies. We work with many. I think at the last count, about 18 different certification bodies across our clients. That's because often clients come in with a relationship already. Talked about UCAS earlier, being the accreditation body. That, in some respects, levels the playing field, so they all have to play by the same rules. But having said that, they are set up differently, different pricing, different ways of operating. And that doesn't necessarily mean one is better than the other, but it just means in some industries or some situations, there might be some that work better for you as a company. So we can advise on that.
And we actually have an episode as well that we do with Jazz from our back office. So in season 1, we do an episode on how to choose a certification body. So if you are wondering about that, you can go check the episode out as well.
Perfect. Yeah, I mean, she knows a lot about that, being in the office far more than I do. But she, I'm sure, would have said that we would give out 2 or 3 or 4 different cert bodies. So we don't direct you which one to go with particularly, but we're just there to advise. So by engaging those certification bodies, you're starting to think about the timeline and the dates and stuff. Now, before you get to certification, and at this point, we're assuming we've done all of the work to implement the requirements. The final piece of that, as we briefly spoke about, was the internal audits. That's a requirement of most standards. Certainly all of the management systems, you have to do internal audits anyway. And although they're called internal audits, we often perform those as a consultant for our clients because we are separate enough from what's actually happening in the company, because we're not doing the day-to-day process. So we can objectively audit those areas. And obviously we know what to look for, where the gaps and weaknesses might be. So we would audit everything, which means looking for evidence that you do what you say you're doing, and looking for evidence that the processes are working. And all of that goes into a report that we produce. And within the report, there'll be everything that we found that's good, and then, of course, there'll be any findings, which could be a potential non-conformity, which means there's quite a big gap. Or there might be some opportunities to improve the system in there that you might want to address later on. But our internal audits are very much like the process the certification body would go through. So that's a good sort of dress rehearsal for that. And although as consultants we're on your side and want to help you get certified, when we do our internal audits, we try and be quite strict because we want to cover off, the worst a certification auditor might be, so that you don't have any problems later on. So we'll do those audits. We'll talk about anything we found with you and how you can fix that, or how we might be able to help you fix it. And once we've got past that stage, the only other key element of most management systems is a management review, which is, again, defined the standards. It's a set of criteria that you need to review, ideally with top-level management or leadership, but it's a good overview of the system as a whole, and we can guide you through that process. But once those two things are done, internal audits and management review, that's really the end of the projects for that year, and we will start to move on to the certification process.
Okay, well, thank you so much for all that information. Now, obviously, at the beginning of this episode, you did say you don't have to contact a consultant. You don't need to have a consultant to implement or achieve ISO certification. But what are the benefits of using an ISO consultant?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, obviously, we'd rather that you did come to us in some shape or form. And there's a number of services. Really, any point on that journey we've discussed today, you could call us and we could come and support, from that point onwards. But I think there's many benefits. Obviously, we do this a lot, so we know where the pitfalls are. We know the common mistakes that people make. We work across many different industries, many different types of company. So we can create a system that works for your business. We don't want to be doing too much documentation or putting too much pressure on the business, but at the same time, we want you to see the benefits of using the standards that are out there. So I think it saves a lot of time, which essentially saves a lot of costs in the long term, because you're doing it once and you're doing it correctly. We, of course, see lots of the audits with the certification bodies. So we sit in on those often for our clients. And that means we can get a good understanding of their approach around different things, particularly with new standards. And there's some new standards coming along. It takes some time once they're published for there to be a consensus over what is kind of an acceptable level of evidence and sampling of certain things. So we can bring all of that to the project. So we can help in that respect. We've mentioned documentation a few times, and it is important, although it's not everything anymore. So there's not going to be loads of it. But if there was anything you needed, we maintain a repository of documents, and we're building on that all the time, and we're editing and updating those documents. So it's likely if you needed something, like a such and such policy, we've probably got something we can draw on and then adapt that for your business. So again, that saves a lot of time and a lot of expense on that one. I think the other thing to mention, which we haven't really talked about yet, but there are many software solutions coming through now.
Mm-hmm.
I think you've spoken to some people, Jess, about various software tools. And they can be great. You don't need to have those. Again, much like a consultant, it's not mandatory and you don't have to have them. But if you do select those tools, you then have to use them kind of properly, right? So it's no good having a tool and you don't know how to use it. So again, that's an area that our consultants can support with, because obviously we see many clients and many different systems. There's a handful of key ones out there that people will recognise. But we can really work with any of those systems because we understand what they're trying to achieve in the standard. And that gives us an opportunity to give some knowledge transfer maybe to your staff, explain kind of the rationale behind some of the ways that they function. So we can support with that as well if that was something that a client wanted. And just like the certification bodies, if you don't have a software tool, but you're looking for one, again, we have good relationships with many different providers. And some work in better situations, sort of better than others. So we can support with that as well.
That's fantastic. Thank you. I think it's good to know, coming into ISO, that if you engage with a consultant like ourselves, it doesn't have to be for the whole project. You can dip your toe in. It can just be for certain bits. It's not all or nothing, which is also, I think, really, really good to know. Well, thank you very much, Rob, for taking the time to talk to me today. It's been an absolute pleasure.
No, likewise. Thank you, Jess.
Wonderful. And thank you to our listeners for listening to today's episode. If you have enjoyed it, please make sure you rate, review, and subscribe. And I'll be back with another episode in a couple of weeks.